Hey, it's Ajay. So I was doom scrolling on Instagram the other day and I came across this video.
आने वाले समय में संस्कृत को कोडिंग लैंग्वेज बनाने वाले हैं।
अभी तक नहीं बना। ये किसने बोला कि कोडिंग लैंग्वेज बनाने वाले?
क्यों नहीं, कोडिंग ही है। संस्कृत तो कोड है ना।
अभी जितने भी इंजीनियर्स कर रहे हैं वो संस्कृत में नहीं कर रहे हैं।
सब सीखेंगे दीदी, सब एक के बाद एक सब आएगा।
संस्कृत की नासा में तो कर चुके हैं बिल्कुल।
So let's break that down. In the video, they're discussing whether Sanskrit, an ancient language from South Asia, should be taught in schools today. And the women in the video claim, hey, Sanskrit's not only relevant, it can be used to code and is actually already being used by NASA to code today. Now, spoiler, you cannot use Sanskrit to code, but this is not the first time I've seen Sanskrit compared to a programming language, and I was wondering, where did she get this idea in the first place? And honestly, if I went to someone who doesn't know much about programming or Sanskrit and I told them, hey, did you know you can use Sanskrit to code now? It kind of sounds believable. So I kind of wanted to get to the bottom of it. Can Sanskrit be used to code? And if not, why is it compared to programming languages so often? So let's start with, what is Sanskrit? Sanskrit is an ancient language that originated in South Asia around 1500 BC. It became a language of religion and high culture and of the political elites in several regions in Asia in the early medieval era. It is the language of many prominent texts associated with major Indian religions, especially Hinduism, but also Buddhism and Jainism. Now, although Sanskrit is not commonly spoken today, it remains a pretty important part of India's cultural and spiritual heritage, and it continues to be studied for its historic and linguistic importance, kind of similar to how ancient Greek and Latin are studied in European countries. When I was in school, I had the option to study Sanskrit as well, and a lot of the traditions in my family still involve chanting prayers and hymns in Sanskrit. So since Sanskrit was the classical language of Hinduism, there seems to be an effort from some people in the Hindu community to continue promoting Sanskrit to be taught in schools and universities, which is fair. Sanskrit is a fascinating language, and it would be great if students had the option to study it if they'd like. But in this process, they seem to glorify the language and talk about it like it has some superpowers. For example, here's this Indian member of parliament who claimed that speaking Sanskrit will fix your diabetes and cholesterol. And if you use Sanskrit as a programming language, the code will just be flawless. Now, I don't even want to get started with why Sanskrit will not cure diabetes, but we're back to this comparison of Sanskrit and programming languages, and it was starting to bother me a bit. Who's behind this? Where is this coming from? So I did look around, and I found quite a few blog posts that talk about Sanskrit's potential as a programming language. And I even found this scene from Interstellar where Matthew McConaughey is using something that looks a lot like Sanskrit, it's actually Hindi, to hack into an Indian surveillance drone. So there seems to be something here, but before we dive into that, let's spend a minute talking about what is a programming language. You can think of a computer as a machine that knows how to follow a set of instructions. And a programming language is a special language that bridges the gap between human thinking and the way computers operate. Programming languages have their own set of special rules and vocabulary, which when put together in a specific way form intelligent programs which can perform a task that could be as simple as adding two numbers or something more complicated like playing this video you're watching. The code that humans write in a programming language then gets converted to machine code or binary instructions that a computer understands. And this is done through a series of steps using a program called a compiler. Now, I could take this program here and change all the words to Sanskrit words, but this does not mean I'm using Sanskrit as a programming language. In the same way that I don't say I'm using English as a programming language, but I'm using Python or Java or C. So Sanskrit and a programming language have fundamentally different purposes. One of them is used to communicate between humans, and the other one is used to send instructions to a machine that only speaks ones and zeros. So you cannot use Sanskrit to code, but if we look closely at the grammar that Sanskrit uses, there are some interesting similarities. Somewhere between the 6th and 4th century BC, the Indian logician Panini, sometimes referred to as the father of linguistics, wrote the Ashtadhyayi, which loosely translates to 8 chapters of grammar. In an effort to preserve the language of the religious hymns and texts of the time, Panini designed a vigorous and sophisticated grammar to minimize the likelihood of the language changing or getting corrupted over time. The Ashtadhyayi is a prescriptive and generative grammar with rules governing every aspect of the language. It consists of 3,959 rules in 8 chapters. The text takes materials from lexical lists as input and describes algorithms to be applied to them for the generation of well-formed words. So it is these grammar rules in the Ashtadhyayi that have some similarities to programming languages because they define a clear set of instructions to modify and generate new words in the language. Let's look at an example. Samasa refers to a set of rules that define the process of forming compound words, and Sanskrit's quite famous for it. In English, a typical compound involves 2 or maybe 3 words. For instance, wall and paper form wallpaper. But in Sanskrit, this process can be repeated in theory an infinite number of times. For instance, you can take the word Raja meaning king and the word Putra meaning son, and you get Rajputra, which means prince. And now you can take the word Rajputra and add the word Vidyalaya, which means school, and you get Rajputra Vidyalaya, which means the prince's school. And you can now take Rajputra Vidyalaya and add the word Adhyaksha, which means principal, and you get Rajputra Vidyalaya Adhyaksha, which means principal of the prince's school. Now, since these Sanskrit rules are well defined and systematic, you could write a function in a programming language to take Sanskrit words as input and modify them according to these Sanskrit rules. For example, here's a naive implementation of this samasa function that combines 2 words. And since we saw that combining multiple words is simply a matter of repeatedly applying the same rule, we could even implement the function in a recursive manner such that it takes a list of words and combines all of them by repeatedly calling this samasa function. And it is because of these similarities in Sanskrit's well-structured grammar rules and a programming language's syntax that experts back in the 70s and 80s claimed that Sanskrit would be the future of AI. But as we know today, building a good language model depends less on the grammar of the language and more on just the sheer amount of data available to train and improve these models. So that's kind of it. Sanskrit's not a programming language, you cannot code in it, but we must admire the sophistication of the grammar for a language that was invented thousands of years ago. So there are genuine, real reasons to be fascinated by and curious about Sanskrit and encourage students to learn it, even if it doesn't cure diabetes or if it's not used by NASA to build rockets. So yeah, don't go around spreading false information. You can spread real information to encourage people to learn Sanskrit. And hope you learned something today. Like, subscribe, drop a comment. Drop a comment if you have something to teach me about Sanskrit. That would be cool. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Otherwise, take care.